What is the Schomburg Center? To me, it is home. The place where we come to see who we really are, not just somebody else's reflection of who we are.
The Schomburg Center is a place of culture, it's a place of history, it's a place of knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is a repository of all of the things that has documented our sense of worth as a people.
For me, that means that it is a place of immense power.
The Schomburg Center is a public research library and a cultural institution
for the study of the Pan-African world.
It is perhaps the best in the world.
My Schomburg Center is Arturo Alfonso Schomburg.
Arturo Schomburg said, Black history and culture and intellect exists at a time when most people didn't believe that. He collected those evidences, and that became the beginning of the collection.
And it has expanded and has grown to where it is now a world-class institution.
It holds over 10 million items.
There's no parallel anywhere that brings to light what we as people of color have done, what we continue to do.
Black culture is all of culture. The universals that animate everyone's life happen here for all people.
The Schomburg, for me, is one of the center pillars of Harlem. When I started the journey of finding out about Red Rooster and Harlem, the very first place I went to was the Schomburg.
Researchers from around the world come and use what we have here.
I could not have written just about any of the books that I've written without the Schomburg Center's archives, resources.
The Schomburg Center is much more than a library. We encourage lifelong learning and exploration.
The Junior Scholars Program is a Saturday program with students from 5th grade to senior year in high school to help them learn about Black history and culture.
Learning about my history is important because it teaches me who I am.
The Schomburg Junior Scholars Program is going to do nothing but uplift them.
So many talented and brilliant people have walked the corridors of this amazing institution over the years. From Octavia Butler to Toni Morrison and James Baldwin, Ella Fitzgerald, Alvin Ailey, and Harry Belafonte, who graced the stage in this room of the American Negro Theater.
This place evokes great memories. It was a gift to us in our community to really try to find that space to reflect expressions of Black experience. I just knew that the environment and what I saw these young African Americans doing was a place I needed to be.
What is my Schomburg Center? I'm standing here at the Cosmogram, which underneath holds the ashes of the poet Langston Hughes. On the evening when this Cosmogram was dedicated, people began to empty out of the auditorium. A jazz trio struck up, and to my amazement, Amira Baraka went over and asked Maya Angelou for a dance. And they started to dance on top of the Cosmogram, on top of the ashes of Langston Hughes, and I felt what a fitting way to kiss the memory of Langston.
The Schomburg Center is a research institute and a library, but it's so much more than that.
There's something going on every day.
So many amazing people come here to talk about their creative craft, to share what inspires them. The Schomburg Center's collections help to tell stories even beyond our walls.
The Schomburg Center is here in this exhibition at MoMA, One-Way Ticket, Jacob Lawrence's Migration Series. We depend on the resources of the Schomburg to enable us to tell this story. Thinking about the implications of the past on the present is absolutely crucial for understanding the next steps, understanding what we have to do to go forward.
We today have the responsibility of making sure that new artists and activists, new scholars and poets know that this place continues to be a resource and a source of inspiration for the work that we must continue to do.
The Schomburg Center is knowledge.
The Schomburg Center, to me, is education.
The Schomburg Center.
But good evening. and welcome to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. My name is Joy Bivins, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of this fine institution, and I also have the pleasure of welcoming you all here tonight. I want to thank you for being here in person, and I also want to send greetings to those of you who are joining us from across the diaspora online. Before I go any further, and you saw him in our video that was cut short, I would be remiss not to recognize the passing of the great actor and activist Harry Belafonte. Mr. Belafonte always described the Schomburg Center as a gift to this community. As we mourn his passing yesterday at the age of 96, the same must be said about him. Mr. Belafonte, born here in Harlem, was a gift to our community, to us, and to the world. He often described his acting career as having its genesis here in the American Negro Theater of our landmark building. He made sure that his entire archive came to the Schomburg Center just a few years ago, and it is here that his spirit and presence will remain. I hope that you will take a moment to enjoy the pop-up exhibition in the Langston Hughes lobby, where there are items from across our collections that feature him. And if we could just, take a moment to remember him right now. Thank you. Our featured presenter this evening is Josef Sorett, and he is also a member of our extended Harlem community, where in addition to serving as a scholar of religion, he is Dean of Columbia College at Columbia University, and he is the first Black man to ever hold that position. The institution was founded in 1754, so I think that deserves a hand clap. I want to acknowledge, so this is where my church training comes in very handy. Wait for the mic. I want to acknowledge the collaboration of Dean Sorett's colleagues and students this evening. This program is presented in partnership with Columbia University's Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, chaired by Professor Kelly E. Jones, and the Institute for Research in African American Studies at Columbia, directed by Professor Mabel O. Wilson. I also want to thank the Lilly Foundation for its support of the Schomburg Center's interrogation of the ways religion and spirituality continue to shape and impact Black communities throughout the diaspora in the 21st century. So before we begin tonight, I have a couple of housekeeping items. I want you to take a moment to silence your phones. Thank you. We ask that you do not use flash to take photos during the program, and if you could refrain from filming, that would be wonderful. This program is being live streamed now on YouTube and can be found on Schomburg's YouTube channel forever. Basically, you can find it anytime after it's being streamed tonight. It can also be found at our website under the Digital Schomburg tab. Pardon me. So now a little bit about Dr. Sorett. He is Dean of Columbia College. He is the Henry L. and Lucy G. Moses Professor and Vice President for Undergraduate Education. He is a professor of religion, African American and African Diaspora Studies, in which he employs primarily historical and literary approaches to the study of religion in Black communities and cultures in the United States, straddling the disciplines of history, literature, religion, art, and music. His first book, Spirit in the Dark, A Religious History of Racial Aesthetics, illuminates how religion has figured in debates about Black art and culture across the 20th century. He is also editor of The Sexual Politics of Black Churches. His new book, Black is a Church, Christianity and the Contours of African American Life, was published just this year. All of his books are available in the Schomburg shop, which will remain open for the evening, and can also be ordered online via schomburgshop.com. Please join me in welcoming Dean Josef Sorett to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. So I just want to follow Joy in expressing gratitude, first to her for the invitation to conversation, as well as to Kevin Matthews, who both is program director, but also former president of the Black Alumni Council, and proposed this idea back in, I guess, February, when we were here as part of the launch for the partnership between Columbia University Press and Howard University in the Black Lives in the Diaspora series. Having participated in many programs here, participated in conversation with colleague Aubrey Hendricks and others at the Harlem Book Festival, having spoken in the Schomburg Junior Scholars Program, the invitation to have an event that featured my book at what I've heard referred to as the archive of the Black world, just a tremendous honor, a place that captures our history, but also is part of the making of that history. Also want to acknowledge Columbia Connections and thank Institutional Home, African American and African Diaspora Studies, as Joy has already recognized both Kelly Jones and Mabel Wilson as director and chair, also the Department of Religion that has really provided the community for me of scholarship over the last decade or so in working through the ideas that are in this book, also in my first book, as the two were written alongside of each other, but really what began in many ways several decades ago as a spiritual journey that eventually took the shape as a scholarly craft. In particular, I want to thank, in light of my most recent position as dean, the Columbia College community. Edwin Torres is here. He told me not to mention him, but I'm going to mention him in helping to facilitate and connect the Columbia College world with my scholarly questions, and thank all he does in the dean's office now to help make us move forward each day. I've seen some students, former and present, and thank them for the space of the classroom in which I was both serving as a teacher, but also really learning from them. Then I also see family and friends from spaces near and far, and I know there are a few folks who told me they'd be online, so I want to thank them for showing up in that way as well. So I was asked to just say a few things about the book. I'm really very much looking forward to the conversation, the questions that Joy has prepared, as well as the conversations and questions you will offer during that portion of the program. So what I will do very briefly is read a little bit from the beginning, depending on how long it takes me to do that. I may read a little bit from the end. And really, in the most basic sense, what is at stake in the title is really trying to understand the relationship between what we mean when we refer to the discourse of race and what we mean when we refer to the discourse of religion. What does it mean to pair? It's decidedly not a book in certain ways about the Black church, and yet it is at the same time. And very much trying to understand the ways in which Blackness itself often functions as a religious discourse. So I'm just going to begin with a little bit of the biography that later took the shape of the research. So Black as a Church is a book filled with ideas that have been with me for far too long. Years before I even imagined that such thoughts might be a book, much of it was written alongside my first book, Spirit in the Dark, but both books reflect my efforts to better understand an overlapping and tangled set of questions that have been with me really before the fall of 2001 when I began the PhD. In truth, the first place I found some language for these concerns was a decade earlier in a classroom in Tulsa, Oklahoma at Oral Roberts University that was taught by Dr. Leonard Lovett on theology and the Black identity. I moved through too many classrooms and read too many books in the years since then, but at the end of the day, this book is about trying to understand the relationship between what we name as spiritual identity, as I called it back then in '93 at Oral Roberts, and racial identity. And like those classroom experiences, a series of everyday episodes, as much as, if not more than, the kind of scholarly questions that I've learned to name in the last 2 decades, have been central to figuring out, right? Some everyday episodes that have been part of daily life taking the shape of a set of scholarly questions. I would argue that those everyday observations, experiences are always at stake in our scholarly pursuits, but in particular, that became a kind of method for the writing of this book. And so I'm going to make mention briefly of 3 episodes that I name at the beginning that span roughly 15 years. First episode is May 2002, Boston, Massachusetts. Nearing the end of my first year of PhD coursework, I was invited by a local elected official, State Senator Diane Wilkerson, to sit on a closing panel of what was the State of Black Massachusetts Conference, convened at the Reggie Lewis Center at Roxbury Community College. And that day, I was joined by an incredible panel that included one-time Boston Rainbow Coalition mayoral candidate Mel King, Deborah Prothero-Stith, then the state's former Commissioner of Public Health, editor-in-chief of the hip-hop magazine, The Source, David Mays, and a couple of others. My job was to speak to the resources that religion had provided to black communities over the years. I don't really recall what I said in my very brief remarks, but what stands out with me to this day from that time was the first question that was posed to me. An African-American man, I would say middle-aged, probably about my age now, who directed his question to me. And his question really came in the form of a comment, more of a call to conversation, went straight to the point. He asked or proposed, when will the black community realize that none of the problems we face will be solved until we all accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, end quote. Second episode, July 2010, New York. In the summer following my first year as a member of the faculty at Columbia, I was enlisted to convene a group of scholars to think through sexual politics of black churches the year before California, and originally the research began the year before California passed Prop 8 on the same day that Obama was elected president. So we had a conversation, first at Union Theological Seminary and then downtown in a closed-door setting. And again, in face of all those scholarly presentations that eventually became a book that was mentioned this evening, one of the presenters began her remarks with a rather casual throwaway comment. She said something to the effect of, culturally speaking, I'm a part of the black church. Quote, culturally speaking, I'm a part of the black church. And then the third episode, April 2017 in New Haven. And this was a year after a research leave. I was working at Yale's Institute for Sacred Music, and we convened a conference on the long history of black gospel music. And the conference was ended with a wonderful keynote/capstone reflection on all the presentations that preceded. And the address began with a scholar who's worked on everything from questions of black masculinity to black music, not a scholar of black religion per se, but someone who's attuned to these questions, began by saying, I may be a heathen, but that doesn't mean I'm unchurched. I may be a heathen, but that doesn't mean I'm unchurched. Now, what do all these things mean, and why am I reciting them here? I'll say just a couple more words, and then I'm going to sit down and look forward to the conversation. Each of these rather casual comments reveal much about the complex inner workings of the power and persistence of Christianity in the making of individual black lives and the kind of logics that play in everyday and academic understandings of the black church, a social institution with material and symbolic significance in American life. Each also illumines the complicated ways that racial authenticity and religious orthodoxy work together, while also pulling us in unpredictable, maybe diverging directions to inform and animate the way we feel, move, and think in the world. In the first episode, Christian salvation was presented as a prerequisite for collective black flourishing. Here, blackness finds its true meaning, in fact, its social salvation, only in alignment with a particular version of Christian orthodoxy. And the second episode suggests that membership roles, right, who signs on to be a member, who joins the church, may not be the only metric or perhaps the best way for understanding who is a part of or belongs in or lays claim to the black church tradition. And the third clarifies as much, even as it suggests something more. That is, the lack of a professed Christian commitment, right? One could be a heathen, whether measured through attendance, membership, belief, or practice, should not be confused for an unfamiliarity with the black church or the absence of the influence of the church on the way one makes their way in the world. In both the second and third episodes, a certain black Christian orthodoxy is seen to have an organizing power, regardless of whether or not one chooses the tradition for oneself or the church. Together, these episodes illustrate just a few of the ways and the many possibilities that result from the peculiar convergence of racial authenticity and religious orthodoxy in Black America. Together, they also powerfully illustrate both the ironies of American secularism, race as a presumably secular discourse, and the still unfolding traditions of Afro-Protestantism. And it's to these traditions that Black as a Church turns. To do so, it begins with the slave narratives and jumps all the way up to the present moment of Black Lives Matter, looking at the ways in which how we perform Blackness often requires also a kind of Christian performance. So I'm going to stop there, and I know Joy is going to come back out in a moment, and look forward to ready for the conversation.
I can come out now.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, boy. So I have to tell you, good evening again, everyone, that I have really been looking forward to this conversation. I've told you that a couple of times, and one of the primary reasons that I have is because of my own spiritual biography. And one of the things that you do in the book is you kind of reference this notion of spiritual autobiography and the ways in which we kind of unpack our relationships to religious institutions, our relationships to conversion, or catechesis is the word you use. I know I had to look it up, but because I'm so steeped in a particular type of church practice and a type of Christianity in my own history, and often that is not taken seriously as a method of study or type of study, I think that these types of texts are so critical because it really does speak to the ways in which we need to look at the totality of our lives and what it has to tell us about not just spiritual interiority, but also where we find our intellectual traditions, our cultural traditions, so on and so forth. So I'm excited to have this conversation because I think that at the end of the day, it is about where are the places and what does this place, this church, mean in the creation of a Black identity. And so I told you I was going to start with this question. And this is not called the Black Church. This is called Black is a Church. And ultimately, you make a verb out of church and out of Blackness. Yeah. So what precisely would you say you mean by Black is a Church?
Yeah. You did ask me this, and I gave an answer downstairs.
You did.
And I said that wasn't going to be the answer I would give up here.
Yes.
But I think that is also just indicative of the fact that I think I don't have a single answer. I think what I'm trying to do, as you were sort of setting the context for asking the question, I was thinking of the Black church, and I was thinking of a church service. And right, so the bigger question is, what does race have to do with religion? That was right. And if we think of a church service, if we think of a Black church service, one may think of the Apostles' Creed as often very much a part of any, right, where folks recite the creed. And one might ask, what does that have to do with one's Blackness? And then one thinks about the other parts, like the episode of someone referring to themselves as culturally part of the Black church. What are they referencing? What are the cultural parts of that service? Is it when church announcements are going on? Is it, right, the sermon that's in a particular aesthetic style? Are those the Black parts? And part of what I want to say is, no, you can't just neatly separate the theology. Like within the field, this is like, we have belief of, what does belief get us to and what does practice get us to? And those categories are not neatly disentangled. And the church is all those things for us in different ways, right? Even just the language of when a rapper like T-Pain has a song called Church and he stages it in a nightclub, right? And it's actually a fight scene in a nightclub. What is the work of that term church doing? I don't know, that's not what I'm trying to do in the book, but that's part of what I'm sort of trying to
get at, and rather than make a claim for what I think, right, it means to say black as a church, is to illustrate a number of ways in which folks have brought those two things together to do very different kinds of things.
Well, in the book you talk about, and this is why it stood out to me, is you reference Amiri Baraka saying black is a country, right? So you are clearly trying to locate blackness.
Yeah.
And you are using this, I struggle to call it institution, because it's many different things, right? As a container, if you will, for different pieces of black identity. And one of those pieces, again, talking about what we were talking about previously, is this notion of black modernity and how religion, you are connecting black religion and black religious practice, black religious conversion with this notion of kind of a black modernity. And usually I don't equate religion with the modern, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you're trying to structure that, how you're trying to unpack it.
Yeah. I mean, the first subtitle for this book was The Ironies of an American Secular, right? This idea that the modern is by default secular. And that has been, right, the dominant story, right? If you think about the Harlem Renaissance, it's a modernizing moment. Look at Elaine Locke in The New Negro is the argument that sort of education is going to take the place of religion in orienting black folk. Except that black folk moving to Harlem are talking about in the language of religion, right? Or, right, they're doing both, right? If I look at the sort of the first example in which you referenced, the genre of spiritual autobiography, so black literary studies talking about what takes place in the slave narratives, the crafting out of a black sense of self is like captured or described as a modern racializing experience, a replacing of an African past with a modern past. If like think of Henry Louis Gates' seminal work, pre-popular Henry Louis Gates as literary critic, but he points to James Graniasaw, and that performance of Graniasaw's racial identity is in the form of Christian orthodoxy. He had to demonstrate that he was a true Christian. And that Christianity.
Like there was a pretense, if you will.
And what's at stake in that pretense? Is he pretending? Is he trying to curry favor? Or is it a performance? And this is, I argue with Professor Hendricks about that, like the performative can still very much be the authentic, racial and spiritual. Is he just spiritually passing? No, right? Like he could be both authentically black and truly Christian in that moment.
I mean, I think we could argue about blackness at that particular moment because I'm not sure it is a fully formed idea, right? So to get to it through the kind of evolution of this institution is one thing I think you're positing in the book, right? Like as the religion or religiosity evolves, so too does a black identity. It becomes more fully formed in these spaces.
Yes. And like to follow the ways in which we tell a set of stories about that evolution, like maps that story in competing ways. If it's like catechesis as a demonstration of literary mastery of these sacred texts, right? I think of the example in these early issues of Phylon magazine, they're capturing the story, the sort of long history of what's this article called The Acculturation of the Negro. And the story of Christianity is one about the making of American citizens in many ways. And there's this odd juxtaposition of in the early years, right, black folk didn't really become Christians, right? Because literacy was the sign. And how does one do that when literacy is outlawed? Well, we know folks still learn to read, but in significant number, there's some things that curtail that performance of literacy and limit access to it. And then the description of the next moment in which black folk overwhelmingly become Christian under the terms of revivalism, the Great Awakenings, is simultaneously described as a fall from the true faith. Right? So that how are both of the terms under which black folk become Christian is somehow a lesser form of Christianity. And, right? What was appealing about that Christianity? It was more democratic in that anyone could come in, literacy wasn't the sign, and maybe the sort of vocal, embodied expressions aligned with other ways of being in the world that were more familiar. At least this is what, right,
Right, and a theology that was not necessarily connected to that of your oppressor.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So a theology that was on the side of those on the margins, right? So
Yes.
when you use Frederick Douglass talking about his Jesus,
yeah,
or his Christianity is not that of those who oppressed
Yes.
and enslaved the people. So there's always this this tension, I think, that you are wrestling with, and I think it's one that people who are of the faith,
yeah, it may not be the orthodox position, right?
Of the faith, but also in the world.
Yeah.
And given the notion that, you know, you learn in Afro 100 that there is no separation between the sacred and the secular, right? And continentally, when you think about So the ways in which Black Christianity is wrestling with that also in different formations is quite interesting.
Yeah, and that, right? I mean, that question of sacred and secular in the context of Black life is like the defining question across all of my work, from hip hop to the literary stuff. Because yes, no sacred secular.
Right.
Except yes, sacred secular. Right? I mean, depending on what kind of Christian you are, right, there's a very clear line between who's saved and who's not, right? I mean, when BB and CeCe record in a certain way, that's good, but then when they record relationships, they're all backslid, right? And so who's drawing that line, when and where?
Correct. I listen to those old songs and I'm like, I don't know. BB and CeCe.
Well, this is,
you know, it's these places, these spaces where, particularly in performance, where it gets very, very muddy. But to go back to this notion of, go back to the book and thinking of some of the things that you said, and even some of the things you referenced when you were reading the episodes, which is something that I wanted to talk to you about, and the one that stood out to me the most and is related to what we're talking about is just because I may be a heathen, but it doesn't mean that I'm unchurched. Right. So in the ways in which we can, one can be outside, but still very much understand the signs, the symbols, the context. If I say a certain thing, whether or not you've been to church in 15, 20 years, you know what I'm talking about. Depending on what your parlance is. I could say, I want to introduce you to some and present you to others. And I'm using a particular way of speaking, right? Or my sisters and I will often make sounds that signify we're talking about a specific person. Well, the exhortation of the church, and you can do that at church. You could do that, and I've seen it happen in the audience at Schomburg many times. So I think in the ways that one of the things that I think is really critical about this book, again, is unpacking where we're meeting ourselves, not just as religious subjects, but as these Afro-Atlantic subjects. One of the things you talk about, a term you use a good deal in the book is, Afro-Protestantism. And it's not something that I use a lot, and I imagine that those of us who are not religious scholars really delve deeply into it, but it is a term, kind of a signpost you come back to often. And I wonder if you could share a little bit about how that really relates to the core of your project. And you can think on it. I can talk some more.
No. That, I mean, I know I've thought a lot about this. I mean, I think, right, part of when I was being socialized in the graduate school, the dominant, and we talked a little bit, dominant ethos was like the critique of the Christian hegemony. Right, and that's a long-standing critique, right? Or, and that it takes on a particular form in right, thinking about within not just Christianity more generally, but the shape of Christianity in black life, right? Everything from Christianity is the white man's religion to, right, all these sorts of things. And yet this institution has been this central force in so many different ways. And so what the debate around the black church, there were several folks calling for, right, as like an academic, a moratorium on the black church.
Yeah, I saw
on that term, like, and is it like, so to me, the black church wasn't the problem, right? And part of but the sort of question was, even if we moved outside the church, if that is a thing that's even possible, where does that get us, right? This idea of descent, like, and that part of what Afro-Protestant helped me to do is still keep hold of those institutional questions about the church, and then think in a variety of ways in which the church as an institution, as a historical force, is not just a space of theology, but as a sign of black freedom, right, as a political space, as a space of pleasure and recreation, continue to shape black life beyond the walls to your point early on. So Afro-Protestantism helps me to hold those two together, and also to make the claim that within the context of black studies, where religion often falls prey to that modern narrative, that this tradition is also a source of theorizing the black experience, right, from the outset, that within the context of, so much of black literature began in connection to black Protestant printing houses. And so how do we claim this tradition of the black church as doing all these things, right? Providing a set of theoretical frames for being in the world, for providing us political space for mobilizing, right? For cultivating a sense of citizenship, for a space of pleasure, all these things, rather than the way in which, at least within those debates 10, 15 years ago, black church was being framed as this calcified institution that is static, which it has never been. And how do we tell a different kind of story about the ways in which churches figure in the context of black life?
Right. So I would, just based on the whole notion that you just brought up, the calcification, and some would argue the irrelevance of the black church, particularly generationally.
Yeah.
What are you seeing in terms of maybe not just scholarship, but practically about the ways in which folks are approaching a theory of the relevance, what the black church means contemporarily?
I mean, that's the new narrative, and right, that in some ways the old tried and true narrative across the 20th century, that the next generation is alienated from the church, right? Like that, how are we going to keep young people in church? Or is this church right? Is this generation increasingly alienated? And this was the narrative around Black Lives Matter, right? That was this is not your grandmother's civil rights movement is, right, somehow a critique of the centrality of Christianity for the modern civil rights movement. And now we have, right, a body of activists who are refusing that politic, not just on theological grounds, maybe grounds on gender and sexuality, so maybe a cultural argument for not being connected to the church. But at the same time, Black Lives Matter was organizing within the context of black churches. Does that mean they're members? Does that mean that anyone who participated in the movement does not adhere to the doctrine, or, right? It's not to make a claim that Black Lives Matter is Christian, but even within, I think of friends who were part of the local chapter here where they were describing having Bible studies that were splintering over a set of debates around what scripture meant for black queer folk, right? So that's not quite the same thing as, right, a group of activists in church in the pulpit, but the hold of that Christian history that had shaped the ways in which many of them came to terms with themselves as adults was then like something that held them together, but then also was something that was a source of fracture in that context.
And it sounds like it may not even be real, right? Because part of the argument is that there is this vision of all of this activism, all of this progressive leadership coming out of black churches, when in fact, that may not be the case. It may be the case for a few or the exceptions, but the black church then becomes a stand-in for a civil rights institution or a civil rights movement, social movement, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And so I think problematizing the visions of Black churches is also a critical thing to do, because sometimes what we think we know, we actually
Absolutely.
may not be the case. Yeah.
Yeah, right. King is the exception, not the rule, right?
Right.
And that vast majority, right? I mean, the denomination that he was a part of, there was a break. A new denomination formed to support King, because the majority of the denomination was not in support of that vision of Christianity in service to Black politics.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
So I think about the National Baptist Association often, the Progressive Baptist Association, what grows out of that, and also the fissures that are not just about where you stand, but also who gets the shine within the institution, right?
Yeah.
So these become places where those kinds of arguments, if you will, or contests happen as well. But I want to go back to the book, because I'll tell you a great story later about
all right,
about King Drive in Chicago.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And I'll tell you now anyway. So as soon as Dr. King was murdered, and maybe you know this, in Chicago, which is my hometown, South Parkway became King Drive immediately. His arch nemesis, J.H. Jackson, whose church was on King Drive, effectively changed the address so that his church would be on 33rd as opposed to 33rd, East 33rd Street.
Anything but King.
Anything but King Drive. Just as a classic example of shade.
And what is more Protestant than that, right? Like, that's like the American Protestant story and the Black Protestant story. We're going to split. We're going to draw that line in whatever way we can from those other, well.
Absolutely. But you also talk about it specifically in literary terms.
Yeah.
And you trace this history from the earliest slave narratives, as you mentioned, to contemporary times.
Yeah.
But there's some tension that you have found in this, what we know as the Negro Renaissance.
Yeah.
But that's also recognized as coming out of the nadir of Black experience, historical experience. So there's this, to me, is very biblical, right? There's the low, and then what's created out of it. And I told you.
I hadn't quite heard it that way, but yeah, absolutely.
I mean, if we want to get into it, but I think that the ways in which you're framing, the ways in which folks are both separating from the notion of Christian hegemony or orthodoxy, but also still you can't really get away from it, right?
Yeah.
Because you have to then write in opposition. You have to create in opposition.
Yeah.
So then you're still referencing.
Yeah. Well, this is right at that moment. Du Bois, what quintessential text for Black studies more broadly? The souls of Black folk. Du Bois at the end of the book says he's like pursuing a new religious ideal. But that's not the story. I mean, there's now several books on Du Bois and religion. But so what does he mean by that? Right? It's sort of what version of religion? Or right? There's a whole tradition of modernist Christianity that it's hard not to read Du Bois as part of that, which isn't to say he identifies as a Christian, but making a claim in Souls as a vision for modern Black life. What kind of religious ideal will be necessary to support Black folk? So, but Du Bois, for however many decades, is cast through a lens of sort of his Marxist commitments or his Pan-African, all those things. But those are not necessarily at odds with, right, a pursuit of a religious ideal that will support Black flourishing in the modern era.
Yeah, I think that problematization is fascinating to me, right? Because one, it assumes we know what the interior, what the reality is, or what the flip side of the intellectual, if you can even frame it that way, is. But often we do separate the intellectual from the spiritual.
Yeah.
And I think we do so to our detriment. I can say that because I'm not writing, I didn't write the book.
No, I mean, I think that is very much, right, part of the, insofar as the book is trying to push back against a certain narrative of Black studies that takes for granted a broader sort of secularizing narrative. One, I want to say that, right, but one looks at the ways in which figures like Sylvia Winters, right, whose, unpublished dissertation now circulates as like a, might as well say a sacred text within Black studies, right, that, and is synthesizing an Afro-Christian perspective in a certain way, a New World notion, or Hortense Spillers, whose dissertation was on the Black sermon and is just now being published at, right, several, like decades after she first wrote it, but is thinking about the figure of the preacher and the sermon as this tradition of theorizing in many ways in Black life, right? You can't separate that, and it's not simply you separate it by calling it an aesthetic performance or calling it, right, the disentangling the theology. I mean, that, to your point around the language of pretense, who knows what Grania Saw was thinking when he was performing his Christian self? But it had the currency of writing him into the modern world as a racialized self, right? And what we can't separate. I mean, maybe we do it very well, but should we, to your point, or what do we miss when we draw that neat line between the spiritual project and the intellectual project? Or
So how do you see this text fitting with, say, Spirit in the Dark? What do you see as the kind of, I know that you said that you had to separate them, right? Because basically you had written two books.
Yeah.
How do you see them in conversation with each other?
Yeah, I published them in the wrong order, actually, right? Like that, not in the wrong order, but I actually they were written after recovering from a dissertation that wasn't what I hoped it would be. And when one does that, one wants to overcome the insecurities about what you didn't do at a certain stage. So I wrote about 300 more pages trying to make sense of what I thought I was doing in a dissertation that included some stuff on hip hop as well, right? Which was, right, thinking through that sacred and secular question. And what in Spirit in the Dark, what I say but don't really argue is, right, in the face of the range of religious ideas that are apparent in the Black literary archive, how is it that, right, at the end of the story, figures like Ishmael Reed are using the language of church, right? How is it that how is it that despite all of our efforts across all these, to decenter the church, I mean, we haven't done it, right? It's, and so it's not just about individual affiliation, it's about the structure of modernity in many ways, right, or of American culture and politics. And so what this book tries to do is that in the face of mapping the diversity of religious traditions, is give a more clear account of the ways in which, across a longer span of time, right, from the late 18th century up till the 2000 teens, illustrate the ways in which Christianity, which is never a single thing or means a single thing, or is referenced as a single thing, still finds a way to reinstantiate it. So even in the form of critique, right, in claiming the Black church is dead, it simultaneously gives a new hearing for a conversation about the Black church.
So I want to make sure that we have time to have questions from the audience as well. We're gonna talk for a couple more minutes, and then if you all have questions, we should start to line up so that we can answer them, or Dr. Sorett can answer them. I'm still wrestling with the text, as it were, as a way. And I had a question that just kind of flew out of my mind, but I'm going to go back to your episodes. And also, I have to say that when you told me you started your academic career at Oral Roberts University, I wondered, I was like, was the goal to be a preacher, or what was the?
This is the problem when you use the language of spiritual autobiography, right? Yeah, not at Oral Roberts. I was pre-med.
Oh.
I went So the church I spent my adolescence in, right? After my parents were 60s kids and left their traditional sort of religious upbringings, very different ones, but still very traditional, they both became born-again Christians. And so I spent my adolescence in a church that would later feed young people to Oral Roberts, a non-denominational, multicultural, word of faith church is what it, prosperity gospel, right?
Got it.
So, which is, Oral Roberts is a kind of epicenter of that particular kind of Christianity. So I knew that world, but they told me I'd have a chance to play basketball, and so I was there. That was, but I was pre-med at the time. But to be at a place like, I mean, as I mentioned, that class with Leonard Lovett in my third year there, Oral Roberts in the 1990s was 20 to 25% black, right? Higher than any non-HBCU, other HBCU in the country. And so we had a kind of black college within this larger now named PWI, but a particular kind of Christian. And yet the discourse for thinking about that, in the degree to which that diverse student body was not represented in the leadership, produced a set of tensions, a set of questions, and they popped up along these lines, right? That a country music singer who was not a religious singer, right, would be invited to sing in chapel. Never in a million years would like an R&B singer, right? Like the fault lines around race, and I was by no means like an activist as a student. I was like all in for much of my time at Oral Roberts, and I would raise a question about some of these things, and I would be told that, you know, God hadn't called me to be the next Martin Luther King Jr. I was not trying, but like this sort of discourse for, right, or when a group would try to form right across there was a seminary there as well, and the black students within the seminary tried to form a chapter of black seminarians, but they were told they couldn't form a group that way, so they renamed themselves Bible seminarians, right? So that they could have a black student organization, but not be recognized as such. Or, you know, there was one year that I lived on a floor where there was a significant group of black students, and this is the 90s, conscious hip hop, golden era, and golden age, and the floor, we decided to name ourselves Brand New Beings, right? But that was like playing with Brand Nubian, right? The ways in which we navigated what was allowable in a public way up against the structure that had a particular racial discourse, all those things. Well, that was not what you asked me, but.
No, but it was, I enjoyed it. One, because I think, you know, it may have just sounded like you sharing what your experience was, but I think it could be, it could be taken to another context, right? In the ways in which maybe not within where there's a racial fight, but there's a generational fight, or there's a gender dynamic within Black church that folks are railing against and coming up with new ways to be in it and of it at the same time, but also to maintain a certain type of identity.
Yeah, or maybe leave it, right? I mean, that was eventually, that space was like, at a certain point, it became no longer tenable for me to stay in that version of Christianity, because the questions I was asking, I was basically being told my salvation was at stake, right? And so then you find a space that's gonna allow you to ask those questions. And that's where I ended up coming back to the church that my mother was raised in and had left, right? Because that church wasn't answering her questions, but that church, this historic AME church, then provided a space for me to bring together that messiness at Oral Roberts, like what was for me.
Right,
it provided a structure for me to think through my Christianity on different terms.
That goes back to this term you use often as well, heterodoxy. Right? So the ways in which people are kind of creating space, even within this Afro-Protestant container, to answer their own questions or worship in their own ways, express in their own ways. And that has a history, right? In terms of, like, at some point, holiness is the thing, and a different relationship with body and tarrying, and all these things are ways to answer particular questions, but they exclude other. And so I think that is something you're speaking to in this book as well. So notion of where we can find not Black church, but a type of Blackness related to Black church. You know
and a type of like version of Black Christian identity that is part and parcel of a lot. Like Christianity becomes one of the discourses through which Black folk hold each other together as a community, right? But that then different versions of Christianity in that space, whether it's the Pentecostal one or other, get a different hearing depending on the moment, right? So you were talking about the turn of the 20th century, the dawn of this new Negro Renaissance, and there's a Black Pentecostal preacher, right, who's part of the genesis of this American movement, who writes an appeal to the sons of Africa. We don't think of him as part of the new Negro movement, right? I mean, this is, and yet he's one of the founders of this tradition of Black Pentecostalism, and he's himself participating.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when looking at the kind of totality of Black church, I'll use the Black church, the moments in which we reject a part of ourselves or embrace a part of our practice, or this will work now, but it won't work. It didn't work then. It becomes this, again, a way of really interrogating our history with this space.
And we do that whether we, like, the folks who interrogate Christianity may still be Christian, and the folks who like embrace Christianity may have a more complicated set of thoughts, right? Like that either or does not, I mean, that's like, what is the relationship between this tradition of church and the larger Black community? And if I ask you like you ask a congregation of 200 members, you know, what that experience means for them, you're gonna get close to 200 different, there may be some overlap, but I think of a good friend of mine who's, you know, we were at Oral Roberts together. And he is now like an exec in the media world. And he said church was the moment where he got his most inspirational professional ideas, right? That was where new ideas for work generated for him. It wasn't about race, it wasn't about theological, or it wasn't about, like, that narrative doesn't fit in the book, but how do we account for the range of work that being in the congregation on a Sunday morning does for us, and that heterodoxy and I think what I would say is on a lot of, like, often in adherence in a public way to a particular kind of orthodoxy allows that difference to be held together, even if it's not always publicly acknowledged or affirmed, right? That,
Very good. So we're gonna stop now and see if we have any questions in the audience. Please go to the mic in the back. There are two.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes, okay. So I'd like to go back to the first question that you posed, Joy. Before doing so, I'd like you to know that I have a coffee holder at home that says, I run on Jesus and coffee. So you read a passage at the beginning, a comment that really stood with you when someone, 1 second, let me just pull it up. Here it is. When will the Black community realize that none of the problems we face will be solved until we accept Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior? I'd like to know what this means to you, what did it spark in you, and how do you believe this reflects the Black experience?
Yeah. I mean, this, thank you for the question. You know, when it was first asked of me that day, in May of 2002, I really didn't know how to I mean, I think I thought of it on academic terms, right? At that point, I was in the middle of coursework, and right, history books will say that, right, black churches have never claimed more than 50% of the members of the larger community, right? Not all black folk are going to be Christian. And so what is that, like, what do we do with that if we know that is the historic reality, right? Even if I took that to be the answer, right, theologically, what do we do with the longer historical narrative? How do we account for the role that a range of religious, like what we name as religious traditions, have played historically and continue to play as a resource in helping black folk make their way in the world? And I think why I settled on it, because it seemed like an out-of-place question at the time, right? There was the rubric for our conversation that day was the state of black Massachusetts. And right, I wasn't surprised by it because we know the central, there was no clergy on the panel, right? So no one serving as clergy on the panel. I was there as a scholar, supposed to give a story about the resources of religious traditions in black life. And then the first question came from a very strident position of Christian orthodoxy as the answer to all these things. And so it sort of, for me, it captured the degree to which, even when within a presumably secular space attendant to the different questions that, right, were present on the panel, that the first immediate response spoke to that, what we then named as a Christian hegemony, and the degree to which it still very much shaped black folks' thinking. Yeah. Thank you.
Good evening. I don't have the book. I mean, I do have the book, but I haven't read it. I just picked it up right before now. But at the end of this conversation, a thought occurred to me that I'd like to pose to you, and that is the idea that black survival is dependent upon the community. And I want to know if that resonates with the title. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, right. That in the broadest sense, church is a form of black congregating, right? It's a form of black social life. When you, I would like taking the cue from Baraka, which I did, this idea of black is a country, right? This notion of black folk constituting a nation within the nation, right? Black churches have played a central role in the formation, right? And here I'm like thinking of the late historian James Melvin Washington, that churches, like the Black Baptist Church in particular, that he's writing about at the turn of the 20th century, is a church that is possessed with the soul of a nation, right? That black aspirations for citizenship took form in the context of churches, and that churches were a space that cultivated, right, a sense of peoplehood, and that the term church in that way, right, references that in the broadest way. Yeah.
And also thinking about it as the place where black people are found, right?
Yeah.
Particularly when it goes to notions of kind of electoral politics as related to citizenship, and also literacy, which is something you talked about earlier. And you know, these are places where people could be educated. Maybe all you had was the Bible, but it is a method of transferring information, and it is a place for gathering information. So it is community in the broadest sense of the word. So to that young lady's question.
I think that's exactly right. Yep.
And we have a question over here.
Yes, good evening. I am a preacher's kid and a personal believer in Jesus Christ. I heard earlier this week, I think it was on the Breakfast Club, where a person asked, or a person suggested that the white majority in this country were introduced to Christianity through love. And the black folks in this country were introduced to Christianity through survival. And it reminded me of a preacher who told me some years ago that in the black church, we didn't even talk about the book of Revelation because we were living it. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. You want to take that one first? Yeah.
I hadn't heard that one. I guess I would. I did come from a church where they taught Revelation, and not well, because it is it is a strange chapter in the text. But you know, and this is anecdotal, not based in kind of scholarly reading. Thinking through the spaces in all of the churches that I belonged to over the course of my life, perhaps that was a moment. There was a moment when it was struggle, but it was also a place where an ethic of love was taught and seen as something to aspire to in various ways, you know, literally Christian ethics within Black church, within a Black church context. So the struggle part and the love part, I would say that in our culture aren't always at diametric opposites, right? Struggle, love, they go together. And so I would say perhaps, but I think both are there, have always been there at the same time. Love for the self in as much as thinking you deserve to be here, you deserve to find resources to survive, and if it's here, then that's where you will find them. But I think that to separate them completely is probably not the way I would approach it. But again, that's an anecdotal take on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I would just say, right, there are a variety of traditions of reading the text that reflect the context in which we, right, the context from which we read is as important as what we think the text says at face value, right? And so, you know, in that there's always been this idea of a book within the book, and which part of the book do we emphasize, and why do we privilege certain texts over another? So, right, Howard Thurman tells a story of his grandmother who was born into slavery, of like advising against reading Paul, right? And, like, why?
Sounds
right?
like Aubrey.
Yeah, right? Because, right, we don't believe in that part that says slaves obey your master, right? So does that mean, right? So we have these different traditions of reading that reflect the world and our experience of survival, trying to find ways to survive and love, and that, so that, how do we attend to the context from which we read, as much as we sort of, especially in a moment where there's a sort of claim around the text says this, like that reading of literalism is itself an interpretive act. How do we account for the social world in which
it was written?
Yeah, both which is written and then where we, right, and the gap between that world and where we are.
The gap between the world that we are, the gap between the languages that we are sharing or contemplating. I think there's a lot to wrestle with that maybe that's where I would say doesn't happen. There's not a lot of wrestling. We just want to know. So
thank you for that.
Thank you. Oh, we have another question.
Abdul Qadir.
There's a beautiful sort of sovereignty to this notion of Black as a church, almost a poetic sort of notion of becoming. I don't want to use the word rope, but like something where you throw something out and you can sort of link yourself to it. And I often wonder about how young folks link themselves back to certain scriptures, church, sovereignty, this notion of away from something yet still within it, leaderless or leaderful, spiritual or present, woke or within. And so leading off the ending of your last question or statement, I wonder about how you take something like this text, which has so much in it, but then also sort of can be broken down into a more sort of youth ministry style. What message, I guess, since the question would be, what message would you, whether it be sort of the notion of sovereignty or poetic or rap verse, would you give to young folks that might also be interested in exploring their blackness through a sort of site of ministry or worship?
That's a good question.
That's a great question. Yet the book does not do that well. But I guess where the book ends, the final words of the book are words of a rapper. And it's a rapper whose song was taken up as an anthem for the movement for Black lives, right? And here we think about Kendrick Lamar's, right, where Be All Right, right? Where if God got us, right? I mean, Kendrick Lamar, to watch his discography evolve, right? Or his more recent identification with the tradition of Black Hebrews, right? A variety of ways in which religion is a central sort of conversation across the corpus of his work, both as parody and as like sort of prophecy, if you will. I mean, that for me, I mean, maybe that it's not ministry focused in a sense, but like the borrowing from Baraka, you're right, that comes from, it's stolen from a poet. And the book ends with a range of writers, right, capturing, with Kendrick Lamar as the final word, turning. I mean, this is more Spirit in the Dark than Black as a Church, right? This idea that the arts might be the resource for folks who don't find spiritual authority or sustenance in what is perceived to be a traditional church setting, right? As early as 1937, Richard Wright is, right, arguing that Black writers have to replace the preachers as myth makers because preachers had been too co-opted by what we now often describe as a politics of respectability, right? That Richard Wright's making that argument 70 years ago or so. Or in the 2010s, right, after the massacre at Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina, that a journalist, right, writes a piece in where she claims Black people are my church, right? Blackness is my ministry. I don't know what exactly she meant by that, but something that connotes a kind of sacred value to Black life. So I guess I would say that from the music to, like, writing is often, writing outside of what we see as or recognized as the sacred text of any tradition, Black writing has often,
I would wholeheartedly agree with that. That it's in the arts which are generative, in the sense that the creative provides space for both the secular to engage the spiritual, right, in a way that is not necessarily under the confines or within the context of orthodoxy or heterodoxy. And so I think that's an interesting way to think through where there's a potential place of connection and engagement for young people.
Absolutely.
For sure. I think we have time for one more question. So, well, let's do these two, if you will. Sir?
Yes. Good evening. I just wanted to talk about the dichotomy between the Black church and white Christianity. The Black church is a place of community caring and a prophetic justice voice to hopefully save America someday. When Martin Luther King wrote Letter to a Birmingham Jail, he was writing to 7 white ministers in Montgomery, and one of them was my bishop, and I was in care under him to become a minister. That's when I realized that white Christianity was wrong, when they told him just stop organizing and just wait. So I left the white church and I joined the Black church. And I've been in the Black church ever since. Because the Black church has a community caring. The white church was individualistic to me, and it was a civil religion blessing America. So it's important that the black church rise again, because it has that community caring and it has prophetic social justice, which just totally distinguishes it from white Christianity. Just wonder if you want to comment.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
I think that what was interesting to me about what you said is an engagement of the black church kind of outside of the confines of race, right? In the sense that you're thinking of it as an idea that where there is caring, there is community, and it is racialized, but it's not racial in the sense. I think that was how I interpreted your comment. So I think that's, I mean, I want the black church to rise too. In terms of, I think that it is still it's critical, it's generative, it's important institutionally. It's a place where the people still are. I mean, you may not think that, but it is a place where people still are. The people still are. And so for me, it is blackness in many ways. It is definitely home. Whether I'm for it or I'm out, I'm like mad or happy or don't agree or whatever, I think that is family. That's how I understand family. Yeah. Sometimes you just don't like them people.
But they're still family.
They're still family. I'm sorry, miss.
Hi. Good evening, everybody, and God bless everybody. My name is Sister Reverend Word. I reside in Harlem, and I consider myself a non-denominational reverend. And that's for many, many reasons. One in particular reason is my interpretation of Bible scripture, Isaiah 11:2. Which in my understanding clearly shows that God is 4 persons and that one is a woman. What I found in my travels is in talking to certain reverends who really present themselves as open to the reality that scripture is really a required learning process and in some ways a required interpretation process. But my understanding of Isaiah 11:2 is very clear that God is also a woman. So my question to you is, because I reside in Harlem, and if you give the right answer, I would like to participate in one of your classes. I really would. If it's really open to really discussion based on Bible scripture that really encourages us to use our best minds and not get so trapped off, pardon my modern day slang, but not get trapped off in the so-called traditions that really omit so much, including the blackness of certain individuals that are clearly shown to be black in the Bible, but clearly shows that love is for every single person. So again, my question is, does your class or anyone in the Columbia University invite really close evaluation of certain scriptures?
I think that I hear a chuckle from a certain Bible scholar who works on the broader black experience, who teaches classes at Columbia as well. Yes, I think the short answer is, and I think like the long history, but whether at Columbia or at Union, of womanist theology, right, that centers the black woman's experience in particular over the long haul, whether in the biblical text up through the present moment. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of you all for your questions. We have one more? Yes?
Oh.
Okay.
Appreciate you taking my question. My name is Hadassah, and my question is, do you think that, I'm sorry, I'm a little short. Do you think that there should be a resurgence or more largely pronounced presence of Black Christianity within social justice initiatives now that in some way imitates or replicates, for example, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that existed during the Civil Rights Movement? And what brought me to, I guess, think of that question is just reflecting on my younger years when I was out protesting, and just reflecting on I guess coming into my critical consciousness and feeling like there was a disconnect between my church and being as explicitly politically radical, I guess, in the way that I would have wanted to see that. And so I'm wondering if there were more examples of the Southern Christian leadership now, how would that help to galvanize youth? And do you think something like that is necessary now, although there are many social justice platforms with young Black people that don't necessarily include a religious standpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess this is probably not a complete answer, but I think there are a range of activists working within church traditions who see themselves as trying to update the work of the civil rights movement, whether it's William Barber and the Moral Mondays movement. So I think there are, in the same way that King was never the rule, that this was a select group within the larger, there are a body of Christian churches. There are also churches and folks working within context of Christianity to try to extend the tradition or a vision of what I think is named sometimes as radical Christianity or prophetic Christianity. They often don't get the headlines, which is maybe a slightly different conversation. So, yeah, I think that the work that William Barber is doing is really important in that regard, and trying to galvanize a grassroots movement, progressive movement. Yeah.
And I would also argue that if you find one church where there is a gospel, a progressive gospel being preached, those folks roll deep. So you will be connected to other like-minded Christians or Christian leaders because there's a deep tradition of really Black nationalist theology or more politically engaged Christian churches that exist. And once you know one, you kind of get to know all of them. So I would suggest that. So, and we really do have to wrap it up. I would like to extend my gratitude to you for this conversation and really, again, for bringing Black religious life. I know it happens. I know that there are many scholars to the center so that we can look at this as a really critical part, not just of our history, but who we are, and theorize on it as a place of spiritual tradition, intellectual tradition, cultural tradition, and for the important work that it's done in creating us as Black subjects. So join me in thanking Professor Josef Sorett.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I could just say, whether you buy the book or not, a good friend and colleague who hosted a book event for me in San Francisco sent a bunch of church fans to go with the book. So you should get a church fan.
Get a church fan, because you never know when you're going to be in church and be hot. Just saying.
Summer's coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you all.